For almost 30 years, Final Fantasy has been one of the world's most popular gaming franchises. From its humble beginnings on the Nintendo Entertainment System to the worldwide hit of Final Fantasy VII to today, where the series is enjoying continued popularity with a successful MMO, multiple mobile games, and the most recent mainline entry, Final Fantasy XV. But it wasn't easy to reach this point. For Square Enix, the publisher and developer of many of the Final Fantasy titles, developing the 15th entry of the franchise included many roadblocks and an elongated development that lasted over 10 years. Everything has a story. This is the story of Final Fantasy XV. In this series, we'll be taking a look at the long development of 15, the release of the final product, and a peek at where the Final Fantasy franchise is today. 2006 marked a turning point in the world of video games. A new generation of home consoles were making their way onto store shelves, and developers were salivating at the prospects of developing games for the first high-definition game consoles. Square Enix was one of these ambitious developers who looked to recreate the success they saw on the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 for these upcoming systems. Square Enix was shaken up by recent developments within the company. 5 years earlier, Squaresoft released Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, an animated feature film that flopped at the box office, putting the company's future in jeopardy. Thanks to successful game releases like Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts, and a merger with former rival Enix, they bounced back, but at a cost. Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi left Square Enix in 2004, leaving the company without one of its most prominent faces and creative minds. This created an opportunity for a new generation of developers to step up in an attempt to fill the role Sakaguchi left behind. The 12th entry in the Final Fantasy series hit Japanese shores in March of 2006, with an international release planned for the fall on the PlayStation 2. This didn't stop Square Enix from showing off the future of the franchise at E3 2006. 3 new titles were announced for Sony's PlayStation 3 and mobile phones at the event, under the banner Fabula Nova Crystallis. Translated from Latin, the title means the new tale of the crystal. The new subseries would share a common mythos, though the characters and scenarios would remain unconnected. The first of these games revealed was Final Fantasy XIII, with a sleek trailer showing off a new heroine and stylish combat. Next up was Final Fantasy Agito 13, an ambitious new title for mobile phones, although it would eventually be announced for the PlayStation Portable as well. The final title announced was Final Fantasy Versus 13, another PlayStation 3 exclusive. Accompanied by a CGI trailer, this spin-off was being directed by Tetsuya Nomura, the creator and director of the Kingdom Hearts franchise. Square Enix's first production department was handling development of the title, after finishing up Kingdom Hearts 2 a year earlier. The new game featured a spiky-haired protagonist with multiple crystal-like weapons, cutting down enemy soldiers. Versus 13 took a darker turn compared to past Final Fantasy games, with characters clad in black and enemies spilling blood when pierced by the protagonist's blade. Nomura stated that the title was chosen as a mirror to Final Fantasy XIII due to this darker theming. This new Final Fantasy featured an interesting tagline: fantasy based on reality. It promised to be a very different take on Final Fantasy. At the time of its announcement, Versus 13 was very early in production. Development started in early 2006, and the reveal trailer served more as a concept than a showcase of the final product. News on the game was quiet for a year and a half. It was finally shown again at a Square Enix fan event, but it was simply an updated version of the trailer shown at E3 2006. Internally, developers were working on various ideas, and Versus 13 was growing to be more than a simple spin-off. Some developers even proposed to make Versus 13 into a mainline Final Fantasy entry. Development of Versus 13 began to slow down during 2008. Final Fantasy 13 was taking more time than anticipated. Staff restructuring led to many of the developers of Versus 13 to be pulled onto the Final Fantasy 13 team. Square Enix insisted that development of Versus 13 had not been halted, but a lack of updates left fans worried. The term vaporware, a piece of hardware or software that was officially announced but never cancelled or released, began to be associated with Versus 13, due to the lack of updates on the project. Final Fantasy Versus 13 wouldn't be shown at E3 2008, but a bombshell announcement about Final Fantasy 13 rocked the gaming world. During Microsoft's press conference that year, Final Fantasy 13 was announced for the Xbox 360. While 13 wouldn't be the first Final Fantasy for Microsoft systems, it would be the first time Final Fantasy would release on multiple consoles at the same time. It also marked the end of Sony's exclusivity of single-player Final Fantasy titles, since the series jumped to the platform in the mid-90s. Versus 13, however, would remain a PlayStation 3 exclusive. Versus 13 exhibited signs of life in late 2008, when new details of the game were finally revealed. A new 5-minute trailer shown at Jump Festa 2008 gave more information on Versus 13 than ever before. A new female adversary, 3 new supporting characters, ominous men in dark suits, ruined cityscapes and open roads, all highlighted by staff credits for the talent working on the game. The trailer still featured many scenes from the initial reveal trailer, and no gameplay was shown, but many exhaled a sigh of relief. Despite the setbacks, Versus 13 was still alive. The next look at Final Fantasy Versus 13 happened at the Tokyo Game Show in 2009. In a closed theater demonstration, Square Enix showcased actual gameplay of Versus 13. The demo had our protagonist, then named Noxus, walking around various environments. The demo did little to impress audiences, but at the very least it showed that progress was being made on the title. While 2010 was a big year for Final Fantasy, it was relatively quiet on news for Versus 13. After launching in Japan in late 2009, Final Fantasy 13 released worldwide on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in March. Despite being met with lukewarm reviews, 13 was a commercial success after being in development for over 5 years. Versus 13, on the other hand, was still in pre-production. In August, Nomura stated that the game's scenario had been finalized and that voice casting was underway. Attempting to set expectations for fans, Square Enix commented that the game probably wouldn't be out by the end of 2011. Final Fantasy Versus 13 was shown for a final time at the Square Enix First Production Department premiere in January of 2011. The event announced multiple titles from Square Enix. Alongside reveals of Final Fantasy 13-2 and Kingdom Hearts 3D, Final Fantasy Agato 13 was renamed to Final Fantasy Type O and given a summer 2011 release in Japan. Versus 13 received a new trailer featuring full voice acting and actual gameplay. The 7-minute long trailer delivered more story details, impressive set pieces, and combat heavily inspired by the Kingdom Hearts series. No release date was given for the ambitious project, but fans had renewed hope. Versus 13 was in full development, and a release was just around the corner. However, a new challenge arose for the development team that would set the title back years. In mid-2011, a new generation of gaming began. Nintendo announced a successor to their Wii console and had released a new handheld, the 3DS, earlier that year. Sony was preparing to launch the PlayStation Vita, and both Sony and Microsoft began showing new hardware prototypes to developers around this time. PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 would be irrelevant in due time. This put Versus 13 in serious peril. As a PlayStation 3 exclusive launching after the release of more powerful and popular hardware, it would certainly spell doom for the title with an ever-growing budget. A change was needed, and Square Enix staff began a massive shift in production in 2011 and 2012. Despite being in some form of development for 5 years, the title was nowhere near complete, with some developers estimating that the game was only about 20 to 25% done. The first change was the development engine, a toolset used by game designers to make their games. Versus 13 was being developed with Square Enix's Crystal Tools engine. Crystal Tools was a powerful engine at the time, but had caused numerous problems in development, with some attributing Final Fantasy XIII's long development to the engine's issues. Nomura announced in September of 2011 that Versus 13 was shifting development to a new engine, known as Luminos Studio, a more powerful engine capable of handling the demands of a new generation of game systems. The staff of Versus 13 was also restructured. After the release of Final Fantasy Type O, many of the members of the game's development team joined the staff of Versus 13. Type O's director, Hajime Tabata, joined the staff as co-director of Versus 13, alongside Nomura. Versus 13 changed the platform it would release on. No longer a PlayStation 3 exclusive, the game would launch on both the upcoming PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. After years of discussion, the title would see one final change during the restructuring. Versus 13 was no longer a spin-off. Its development would be rebooted from the ground up as the 15th mainline Final Fantasy game. This was the best possible result for Versus 13. Executives at Square Enix were unhappy with the game's long development time, with some wanting to cancel the game outright in an attempt to protect the Final Fantasy brand. Part of this reasoning came from Final Fantasy XIV, an MMO released on PC in 2010. Upon release, the game was a massive flop, and Square opted to pour resources into saving the title rather than abandon the player base. This came on top of long development times for various other Final Fantasy projects, including Final Fantasy XIII and Type O. Saving Versus 13 did come at a cost to the staff of the title, as many of the developers were sent to other development teams during the staff restructuring. Rumors of the restructuring wouldn't remain a secret for long. With the game out of the public's eye for over a year, rumors began cropping up from various media outlets in mid-2012 that Versus 13 had become Final Fantasy 15, with development being pushed to the next generation of consoles. Other rumors stated that the game had been cancelled outright. Square remained silent on the rumors. It wouldn't be until February 2013 when Shinji Hashimoto, the brand director of Final Fantasy, made an announcement during Sony's PlayStation 4 reveal event. No gameplay or trailers were shown. Not even a title screen was seen in the auditorium. Hashimoto simply stated that a new Final Fantasy game was being made for the PlayStation 4, and that Square Enix would have more details at E3 2013. The world is ever changing. At E3 2013, Final Fantasy Versus 13 was seen publicly for the first time in over 2 years. A new trailer dropped in the middle of Sony's legendary press conference announcing the title for the company's upcoming PlayStation 4. The game was notably different from past iterations. Many new characters joined the fray, with some old ones nowhere to be seen. The trailer showcased new story elements, a massive battle with Leviathan, a longtime series boss, and a reworked combat system. The most startling information for the trailer came at the end, when the game's logo shattered, only to be reformed with a new name: Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15 seemed like it was finally coming, but no release date was on the horizon. At Square Enix, the title was still very early in development at the time of its re-announcement. The trailer shown at E3 2013 was mostly CGI, and was being used as more of a concept piece, similar to the first trailer for Versus 13. More staff shakeups came a few months after the re-announcement. In late 2013, Hajime Tabata became the sole director of Final Fantasy 15. Tetsuya Nomura stepped away from the game to focus on other projects. Development of 15 was officially moved to Square's second business division during this time. This staff reshuffling came at a cost to the development team. Tabata's new goal was to release the game in a timely fashion, and meant that developers wouldn't be able to experiment with many new concepts during the tightened development time. News of Final Fantasy 15 would be quiet for the next few months. It wasn't seen again until the Tokyo Game Show 2014. At the show, a new demo was announced for Final Fantasy 15, titled Episode Duske. The demo would be packaged with first-run physical copies of Final Fantasy Type O HD, a remake of the PSP original that Square first announced at E3 2014. Square Enix also publicly announced Nomura's exit from the development staff and Tabata's ascension to sole director at the show. In March of 2015, Final Fantasy Type O HD released worldwide on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. While many were certainly excited to play the title for the first time, even more were excited to play the included demo. Almost 9 years after the title was announced, the public was finally able to play Final Fantasy XV. The episode Duscae demo was a reworked portion of Final Fantasy XV that took place early in the game. Players trekked through the Duscae region of the title, exploring the locales and battling monsters along the way. It was also a great introduction to many of the characters, including Noctis, his supporting friends Ignis, Gladiolus, and Prompto, and other non-playable characters like Cindy. The rest of 2015 was highlighted by new announcements about the game through live streams known as Active Time Reports, or ATRs. This change was greeted positively by fans who were tired of being left in the dark during the game's long development time. A release window of Final Fantasy XV was finally revealed during this time, for a release sometime in 2016. On March 30th, 2016, Square Enix held an event known as Uncover Final Fantasy XV. The event shared new details on the game, including a second playable demo titled Platinum Demo. The demo was available for download through Xbox Live and PlayStation Network that day. It was shorter and more linear than episode Duscae, lasting only around 30 minutes. Tabata stated that the demo offered players a chance to try the game's combat, while also serving as an introduction to Noctis and his backstory. The biggest announcement of the event was an official release date for Final Fantasy XV. The game was coming out worldwide on September 30th, 2016. The release of Final Fantasy XV was fast approaching, and Square Enix brought the game in full force to its final E3 showing. The game was shown off during Microsoft's press conference that year with a brand new trailer, and the game was playable for many of the guests at the show. In August, Square Enix announced details on Final Fantasy XV's upcoming DLC. A season pass for the game would be available and included story content, an unnamed multiplayer mode, and other in-game items for players. With about a month before release, rumors of the game being delayed began to crop up once more. Square Enix later confirmed these rumors, stating that Final Fantasy XV would miss its initial release date by 2 months to allow developers to polish the title and avoid a massive Day 1 patch. Its new release date was November 29th, 2016. Approaching Final Fantasy XV's release, Square released multiple media tie-ins for the game. An animated series, Final Fantasy XV Brotherhood, released throughout 2016 on YouTube and Crunchyroll. Each episode lasted around 10 minutes. The 5-part series told the backstory of Noctis and his companions during their childhood and events before the game. A CGI feature film known as Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV came out during the summer of 2016. The film explored elements of 15's story that took place away from the main protagonist at the start of the game. The film had some notable actors voicing various characters, including Aaron Paul, Lena Headey, and Sean Bean. On November 29, 2016, Final Fantasy XV released worldwide on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. It was the first time in the series' history that a mainline title launched in all markets on the same day. 3 different versions of the game were available at various retailers. A Day 1 edition included a download code for additional in-game items. The deluxe edition came in a slick steelbook packaging and a copy of Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV on Blu-ray. A collector's edition was available exclusively through Square Enix's online store and included a statue of Noctis alongside other goodies. The final release of the game was notably different than Versus 13. The combat took a step away from Kingdom Hearts and focused on a more streamlined action experience. The game took heavy inspiration from open-world titles, with most of the game taking place in large open plains for the player to explore. Players were no longer able to swap between playable characters as first envisioned. Final Fantasy XV would only feature Noctis as a playable character. The game was met with generally positive reviews. The gameplay was praised by critics, and the game's visual flair wowed audiences. The game's story received a more mixed reception. Players loved Noctis and his band of beautiful boys, but were let down by the small amount of screen time the rest of the supporting cast received. The narrative was also met with some negative remarks, notably regarding the game's second, more linear half. Within 24 hours of release, Square Enix announced that they had shipped 5 million units of the game already. The high sales managed to break even on 15's development cost that had ballooned over its 10 years of development. The launch of 15 was a massive success, with Tabata commenting that the title likely saved the Final Fantasy series after it's been around a decade and languish. To date, Final Fantasy 15 has sold over 8 million copies worldwide. A day one patch for Final Fantasy 15 was still needed, despite the game's 2-month delay, and other patches have been released since the title's release. In March of 2017, a major update reworked portions of the game. The biggest change came in the game's 13th chapter, which many fans and critics criticized for its slow pace, lack of story, and radical change in gameplay. The update changed certain gameplay elements and added additional story segments to help with pacing. Final Fantasy XV Season Pass saw its first new content release in March of 2017 with episode Gladiolus. 2 more episodes came in June and December, following Prompto and Ignis respectively. Each episode followed the title character during a segment of 15 where they were split from the party. The DLC packs were well received for expanding on the story of 15, but their short length left many wanting more. A 4th piece of downloadable content came in November 2017 under the title Comrades. Comrades is a multiplayer title based around the gameplay of Final Fantasy XV and takes place during the events of Final Fantasy XV. Players create their own character to battle Final Fantasy monsters, alone or with friends. The expansion has received multiple updates since its release, and a standalone version was released in December 2018. Final Fantasy XV wasn't done after the release of its Season Pass. In February 2018, Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition released on mobile phones. This slimmed-down version of the game featured the main story of 15, a simplified art style, and reworked combat for mobile devices. The first chapter is available as a free download, with subsequent chapters being paid. Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition was ported to PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and the Nintendo Switch throughout 2018, with improvements for home consoles. An enhanced version of Final Fantasy XV came out on March 6, 2018, known as Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition. The game came out on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC, and featured the base Final Fantasy XV game, all updates for the title since release, and the game's Season Pass, alongside other downloadable content. The success of Final Fantasy XV and its DLC led to the announcement of 4 new episodes in September 2017. Episode Arden, Arania, Luna, and Noctis were announced, with an intended release date of 2019. The episodes were under the banner of Dawn of the Future. The first 3 episodes would reveal more story information on 15's villain and supporting cast. The 4th episode, Episode Noctis, would be an alternate ending for 15. The DLC was to be developed under Luminos Productions, a newly formed internal studio at Square Enix, headed by 15's director, Hajime Tabata. Unfortunately, this DLC would not come to pass. In November 2018, Square Enix announced that only episode Arden would be released, with the other 3 episodes cancelled. The news came alongside the announcement that Tabata was leaving Square Enix, and the role of director of Final Fantasy XV. Tabata announced that he was starting his own studio, JP Games, and would focus on a new project. Luminos Productions was still on track to finish episode Arden, set for release in March 2019. After that, their focus would be on a new AAA title within Square Enix, which is yet to be announced. The 3 cancelled DLC episodes aren't gone entirely. Square Enix plans to release the stories of these episodes as a novel, set for release sometime in 2019. Soon, the story of Final Fantasy XV will come to a close. With the release of episode Arden on the horizon, the title will no longer receive any updates, and Square will likely focus on the upcoming remake of Final Fantasy VII and a new generation of home consoles set for release in the near future. The development of Final Fantasy XV was a long and difficult one. From the start of the game's development, resources were snatched away from it to create Final Fantasy XIII, and pushed the game's development further and further back. Tetsuya Nomura, the game's original director, was pulled into so many projects within Square as a director, designer, and producer that it left the development team leaderless and unfocused. coupled with the struggles that many developers faced when designing games for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and later by the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, it's a miracle that Final Fantasy XV even came out. In the end, I'm grateful. Final Fantasy XV is a wonderful, albeit flawed game. I jumped from my chair when the game was announced in E3 2013, and jumped again when the game showed up on my doorstep in 2016. 15 renewed my hope in both the Final Fantasy series and Square Enix, who has gone on to publish many fantastic games since the release of 15. I'm happy to say that I'm a fan of Final Fantasy, and I look forward to the day that Final Fantasy VII Remake comes out, and when the inevitable 16th entry in the series is finally revealed. Let's just hope that day comes before another decade has passed. I hope you enjoyed the story of Final Fantasy XV. If you missed the previous episode, be sure to check it out. I also have videos on Kingdom Hearts, the Nintendo GameCube, and more here on the channel. Be sure to subscribe to catch the latest videos when they come out, and leave a comment on what series you would like to see next. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and share this video on social media sites to help this channel grow further. Until next time, thank you for watching.